My name is Sarah, and over my 36 years, I've learned that life can change in the most unexpected ways. I once believed I had the perfect life via a dedicated husband, a cozy home, and a peaceful existence in a quiet American in the stability most people dream about. But perfection is a funny thing. It can mask a storm brewing beneath the surface, one so subtle you don't even see it coming until it's too late. David, my husband, is a good man, a provider. He drives trucks for a living, hauling goods across states to keep a roof over our heads and food on the table. He's the kind of man who never misses a day of work even when he's tired to the bone, but his job takes him away for long stretches, sometimes weeks at a time. Over the years, the distance between us became more than just physical. At first I busied myself with routine, taking care of the house, volunteering at the church, and occasionally meeting friends for coffee. But over time the loneliness set in heavy and relentless. I found myself going to church more often, not just for solace but for connection. It was there that I met Pastor Lucas. Pastor Lucas had a way of speaking that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. His sermons were powerful, his voice deep and soothing, and his smile, well, it could melt away your worries. He wasn't just a preacher, he was a counselor, a guide, someone you could confide in without judgment. At least that's what I thought. One Sunday after service I stayed behind to help clean up the fellowship hall. Pastor Lucas approached me as I was stacking chairs. "Sarah," he said, his voice low but warm, "I've noticed you've been coming to church more often. Everything okay at home?" I froze, the chair slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. "Oh yes, everything's fine," I said quickly, bending to pick it up. He crouched beside me, his hand resting lightly on mine as I reached for the chair. "You know, the church is more than a place to worship, it's a sanctuary. If you ever need to talk, my door is always open." His words lingered with me long after I left that night. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I thought about how long it had been since anyone had asked how I was really doing. David called earlier, as he did most nights, but our conversations were always the same, short, practical, and to the point. There was no depth, no warmth. The next week I took Pastor Lucas up on his offer. I told myself it was harmless, just a counseling session with my pastor, but when I walked into his office the atmosphere felt different. The room was cozy with bookshelves lining the walls and a faint scent of sandalwood in the air. Pastor Lucas sat behind his desk, his eyes lighting up when he saw me. "Sarah," he said, gesturing to the chair across from him, "I'm glad you came." I poured my heart out that day. I told him about David's long absences, my loneliness, and the growing emptiness in my marriage. He listened intently, nodding and occasionally offering words of encouragement, but it was the way he looked at me, like I was someone who mattered, someone worth listening to, that unraveled me. "You're not alone," he said finally. "God sees your pain and he's placed people in your life to help you carry the burden. Don't be afraid to lean on them." His words were like a balm to my soul. I left his office feeling lighter, as though a weight had been lifted off my shoulders, but that relief was short-lived. A week later, after another session, I found myself lingering. As I got up to leave, Pastor Lucas walked me to the door, and just as I reached for the handle he touched my arm. "Sarah," he said softly, his eyes searching mine, "you're stronger than you think. Don't ever forget that." His hand lingered for just a moment too long, and I felt a jolt of something I couldn't quite name. I nodded, muttered a quick thank you, and practically bolted out the door. That night I couldn't stop replaying the moment in my head, the warmth of his hand on my arm, the way his voice softened when he spoke my name. It was all too much and yet not enough. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking things, but deep down I knew something had shifted. The storm had begun and there was no turning back. I didn't mean for it to happen, at least that's what I kept telling myself, but as the days turned into weeks I found more and more excuses to visit the church. At first it was to help with the women's ministry or organize supplies for the food pantry, then it became private counseling sessions with Pastor Lucas. Each time I stepped into his office I promised myself it would be the last, and each time I left more entangled in feelings I couldn't fully understand. Pastor Lucas had a way of looking at me, of speaking to me, that made the rest of the world fade away. He wasn't just listening, he was seeing me, the parts of me that David had long stopped noticing. One Thursday evening the church was quiet. Bible study had ended an hour earlier and the parking lot was nearly empty. I was in Pastor Lucas's office, seated across from him, like always, sharing bits and pieces of my heart, but this time the air felt charged, heavier than usual. "You've been carrying so much, Sarah," he said, his voice low. "It's not fair for one person to bear such a burden alone." I looked down at my hands twisting the hem of my blouse. "I guess I'm just used to it. David doesn't mean to neglect me, but his work." His hand was on mine before I could finish the sentence. The sudden contact made me look up, and when our eyes met I saw something in his gaze that I hadn't seen before. It wasn't just compassion, it was longing. "Sarah," he said softly, his thumb brushing the back of my hand, "you deserve to be seen, to be cherished." My heart pounded in my chest, and I knew I should pull away, should stand up and leave, but I didn't. Instead I stayed frozen, caught in the intensity of the moment. And then it happened. He leaned forward, his hand moving to cut my cheek, and before I could process what was happening his lips were on mine. It wasn't forceful or rushed, it was tender, slow, as if he was giving me a chance to pull away, but I didn't. For a brief dizzying moment I let myself fall into him. His lips were warm, his touch gentle, and for the first time in years I felt alive. But then reality came crashing down. I pulled back abruptly, my breathing uneven. I can't," I stammered, standing up so quickly my chair scraped against the floor. "Sarah, wait," he started, but I shook my head. "I have to go," I said, grabbing my bag, rushing out of the office. The cold night air hit me like a slap as I stepped outside. My mind was racing, a chaotic mix of guilt, shame, and confusion. How had I let it get this far? That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes I felt his lips on mine, his hand on my cheek. I tried to push the memory away, to focus on David and the life we'd built together, but the harder I tried, the more I felt the cracks in our marriage widening. The next morning I avoided my reflection as I got ready for the day. I couldn't face myself, couldn't bear to see the woman I was becoming. But as the hours passed I found myself replaying the kiss, not with regret but with yearning. By the time Sunday rolled around I was a bundle of nerves. I considered skipping church altogether, but I knew that would raise questions, so I went, sitting in my usual spot in the second row, my hands clasped tightly in my lap. Pastor Lucas stood at the pulpit delivering a sermon about forgiveness and grace. His eyes flickered to mine once, twice, and I felt a pang of something I couldn't name, guilt, desire, both. After the service I tried to slip out unnoticed, but he caught me near the exit. "Sarah," he said, his voice calm but firm, "can we talk?" I hesitated, glancing around to make sure no one was watching. "I don't think that's a good idea, please," he said, his eyes searching mine just for a moment. Against my better judgment I followed him back to his office. The door closed softly behind me and the quiet was deafening. "I'm sorry," he began, his hands resting on the edge of his desk. "I crossed a line and I shouldn't have." I nodded, swallowing hard. "It wasn't just you," I admitted, my voice barely above a whisper. He took a step closer, his expression earnest. "I don't want to hurt you, Sarah, but I can't pretend that I don't feel something for you." His words hit me like a freight train. I wanted to deny it, to tell him he was wrong, but the truth was staring me in the face. "I felt something too. I don't know what to do," I said, finally, tears welling up in my eyes. He reached out, brushing a tear from my cheek. "We'll figure it out together." In that moment I felt the storm pulling me under, and I wasn't sure I wanted to fight it anymore. I should have stopped. I should have walked away from that room and never looked back, but something inside me wouldn't let go. The kiss had awakened a part of me that I'd buried for years, a part that craved attention, affection, and the kind of intimacy that David, with all his long hours on the road, couldn't provide. At first it was just more counseling sessions, though the tone of them had shifted. Pastor Lucas and I shared more than just scriptures and prayers. We shared glances that lingered too long, words that carried hidden meanings, and attention that hung in the air like a secret only we understood. One Friday afternoon, after I dropped off groceries at home, I found myself in his office again. This time the door wasn't left ajar like it usually was. Lucas had locked it behind me. "Sarah," he said, his voice softer than usual. He walked around his desk and sat on the edge facing me. "I can't stop thinking about you." I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. I could feel my pulse quicken as he reached out, taking my hand in his. This isn't right," I whispered, though my resolve was already crumbling. "I know," he said, his thumb brushing against my knuckles, "but sometimes the heart doesn't follow the rules." Before I could stop myself I was leaning into him, and his arms wrapped around me as if they'd been waiting to do so all along. That afternoon lines were crossed that I could never uncross. Afterward I drove home in a daze. The guilt was immediate and suffocating, but so was the memory of his touch, his words, his lips. I walked into the house and found David sitting at the kitchen table, his lunch box open and his face weary from hours on the road. "Hey," he said, smiling faintly as I set my purse down. "Didn't know you'd be home so soon." I forced a smile. "Just ran some errands." He nodded and went back to eating, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. The next few weeks were a blur of stolen moments and whispered promises. Lucas and I found excuses to see each other: quick meetings in his office, lingering conversations after Bible study, and even a few late-night phone calls when David was out on the road. Each encounter was intoxicating, pulling me deeper into a world I knew I didn't belong in. But the lies started to pile up. "Where were you this afternoon?" David asked one evening as we sat on the couch. "Just helping out at church," I replied, keeping my voice steady. He nodded, trusting as ever, and turned his attention back to the TV. I felt a pang of guilt so sharp it nearly took my breath away. At church I began to notice the looks. A few women in the congregation seemed to watch me more closely than before, their eyes narrowing slightly when Lucas and I were in the same room. I tried to act normal, to pretend everything was fine, but the weight of the secret was growing heavier by the day. One afternoon, while organizing hymnals in the sanctuary, a friend from the women's ministry, Karen, approached me. "Sarah," she said, her tone casual but her eyes probing, "you and Pastor Lucas seem to spend a lot of time together." I froze, clutching a hymnal tightly. "Well, Hugh's my pastor," I said, forcing a laugh. "It's normal, isn't it?" She shrugged, her gaze never leaving mine. "I guess just be careful, okay? People like to talk." Her words lingered long after she walked away. "People like to talk, Lucas, and I tried to be careful, but secrecy has a way of amplifying everything. Every touch, every glance, every whispered word felt heightened, as though the risk of being caught added fuel to the fire. One evening David came home early from a trip. I was in the kitchen preparing dinner when he walked in and wrapped his arms around me from behind. "Missed you," he murmured, kissing my neck. I stiffened, the memory of Lucas's touch still fresh in my mind. "You okay?" David asked, pulling back to look at me. "Yeah," I said quickly, forcing a smile, "just tired." He frowned but didn't press further. That night as he lay sleeping beside me, I stared at the ceiling, guilt gnawing at my insides. What kind of woman was I becoming? David had done nothing to deserve this. He was a good man, loyal and hard-working, and yet I couldn't stop. Lucas had become a drug and I was addicted. The turning point came one Sunday after service. I was helping clean up the fellowship hall when Lucas cornered me in the storage room. "We need to talk," he said, his voice low. "Not here," I hissed, glancing over my shoulder to make sure no one was around. He stepped closer, his presence overwhelming. "I can't keep doing this, Sarah, sneaking around, hiding how I feel about you. It's tearing me apart." I stared at him, my heart pounding. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I care about you," he said, his voice breaking. "But this isn't sustainable. We need to figure out what we're doing." Before I could respond, the sound of footsteps outside the door made us both freeze. My heart raced as I heard Karen's voice calling my name. I quickly stepped back, smoothing my dress as Lucas unlocked the door. "There you are," Karen said, her tone cheerful but her eyes sharp. "We could use your help in the kitchen." I nodded, mumbling something about finishing up here, and followed her out of the storage room. My hands were trembling as I walked away. I could feel Lucas's eyes on me, and for the first time I wondered if we'd gone too far. Balancing my double life was becoming impossible, and the cracks were starting to show. I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen knew more than she let on. Every glance she threw my way felt calculated, as if she was waiting for me to slip up. I started avoiding her, making excuses to leave conversations early or keeping my distance during church activities. Lucas and I also became more cautious. The stolen moments were fewer, the lingering touches shorter, but despite our best efforts the guilt weighed heavier with each passing day. One evening after a particularly restless night, I found myself sitting in the kitchen with a glass of wine. David had gone to bed hours ago, exhausted from another long day on the road. I stared at the liquid, swirling it absent-mindedly, my thoughts tangled in a web of lies and regrets. How had it come to this? How had I become this person? Someone who could look her husband in the eye and lie without hesitation. The door creaked and I looked up to see David standing in the doorway, his hair disheveled from Couldn't sleep, he asked, his voice groggy. I shook my head, just thinking. He walked over and sat across from me, his eyes searching mine. You've been distant lately, is everything okay? My heart skipped a beat. Of course, I said, forcing a smile, just a lot on my mind. David reached across the table, taking my hand, and his touch was warm, familiar, and it sent a pang of guilt shooting through me. You know you can talk to me, right? He said softly. I nodded, tears stinging my eyes. I know, but I couldn't tell him not this. The following week Karen cornered me again, this time after a women's ministry. Sarah, can we talk? She asked, her tone leaving no room for refusal. Sure, I said, trying to sound casual. She led me to an empty classroom and closed the door behind us. My heart raced as I braced myself for whatever was coming. Look, she began, folding her arms. I'm not trying to pry, but people are starting to talk about what I asked, feigning ignorance. She raised an eyebrow. About you and Pastor Lucas. I felt the blood drain from my face. There's nothing to talk about, I said quickly. Isn't there? She countered, her gaze piercing. I opened my mouth to respond, but no words came out. Karen sighed, her expression softening slightly. Sarah, I don't know what's going on, and honestly I don't want to know, but you need to be careful. These kinds of rumors can ruin lives. Yours isn't your husband's. I swallowed hard, nodding. Thank you, I murmured, barely able to meet her eyes as she left the room. I felt like I'd been punched in the gut. The walls were closing in and I didn't know how much longer I could keep this up. Lucas and I met later that week in his office. The tension between us was palpable, and for the first time the fire that had once burned so brightly felt like it was beginning to flicker. Karen spoke to me, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Lucas frowned. What did she say? She knows, I replied, tears welling up in my eyes, or at least she suspects, and she's not the only one. He ran a hand through his hair, his jaw tightening. This is getting out of hand. I can't do this anymore, I said, my voice breaking. I can't keep lying to David, sneaking around, feeling like everyone's watching me. Lucas reached out, taking my hands in his. Sarah, I care about you, you know that, but maybe you're right. Maybe we need to take a step back. The words hit me harder than I expected. A part of me had hoped he would fight for us, for whatever it was we had, but deep down I knew this was the only way. I think it's for the best, I said, though my heart felt like it was shattering. We sat in silence for a moment, the weight of our decision settling over us like a heavy blanket. When I left his office that day I promised myself it was the last time. No more stolen moments, no more whispered confessions. I was going to fix my marriage, rebuild what I had broken, and bury this secret so deep that it would never see the light of day. But secrets have a way of surfacing, no matter how hard you try to hide them. After that final conversation with Lucas, I did everything in my power to move forward. I poured myself into my marriage, determined to rekindle the spark that had long since dimmed. I cooked David's favorite meals, greeted him with a warm smile every time he walked through the door, and even planned a weekend getaway for just the two of us. At first it seemed to work. David responded to my efforts with gratitude, his face lighting up in ways I hadn't seen in years, but deep down I knew something wasn't right. The guilt of what I'd done lingered, an unwelcome guest that refused to leave. One Saturday morning as we were having breakfast, David looked up from his plate and said, "You've been different lately." I froze, my fork halfway to my mouth. Different how? Just I don't know, happier maybe, or more attentive. He smiled. "Whatever it is, I like it." I forced a laugh. "I guess I've just realized how much I appreciate you." He reached across the table, taking my hand in his. "I appreciate you too, Sarah." His words should have comforted me, but instead they felt like a knife twisting in my chest. How could I sit here holding his hand while carrying such a terrible secret? Church became more difficult to navigate. I avoided Lucas as much as possible, keeping our interactions strictly professional and limiting our conversations to church-related matters. But Karen's words haunted me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that people were watching us, scrutinizing our every move. One Sunday during the post-service fellowship, a woman named Denise approached me. "Sarah, can I have a word?" she asked, her tone friendly but her eyes sharp. "Of course," I said, plastering on a smile. She led me to a quiet corner of the room and crossed her arms. "I don't mean to pry, but I've noticed you and Pastor Lucas seem close." My heart sank. "You and my pastor?" I said, keeping my voice steady. "It's normal to be close with your pastor, isn't it?" She tilted her head, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Sure, but some people might see it differently. Just be careful, okay?" I nodded, feeling like a trapped animal. "Thank you for your concern." As she walked away, I felt a wave of panic wash over me. The rumors were spreading, and it was only a matter of time before someone